Welcome back to Analysis. In today's programme, we've been trying to work out where US foreign policy may be heading in the years to come following the speech given by President Obama last Wednesday. In the speech, he spoke about strong global leadership, which did not need to turn on military action. But what are the alternatives? And given Obama's track record so far, does he really intend on using them? With me in the studio is Professor Keith Hayward, who's Head of Research at the Royal Aeronautical Society, Peter Finn, Lecturer in Politics at Kingston University. And we're joined for this half by Paul Schultz from King's College London, and on the line by Andrew Smith from the Campaign Against the Arms Trade. Welcome to you all. Now, just before the break, Keith, we were just talking about what American foreign policy might be doing in terms of the major challenges that it has in terms of Russia and China. And I think you were saying that it's perhaps a decade before they've got the kind of equipment that can project their forces to deal with those kind of.
Well, I mean, if you're looking at unmanned systems, yes. I mean, this is you wouldn't survive. Current generation of Predators and Reapers wouldn't survive if they were in an environment shaped by a Russian air defense system. What we're like, and certainly the United States is heavily committed to what you might call conventional weapons platforms. The spending on the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter out over the next 20 years will dwarf any spending on remotely piloted vehicles. We're talking, in the case of the F-35, something that's going to cost 80 to 90 billion in terms of a program. So in that sense, the United States is still committing primarily to conventional weapon systems, whether they be aircraft or whether they be carrier task forces.
Paul, I mean, in terms of these kind of emerging challenges, now we've had a crisis with Georgia in 2008, the crisis over the Ukraine now, the talk of the pivot to the Pacific. What do you think the American foreign policy intention here is? What do you think its capabilities are?
Well, I think it's a much bigger thing than high-tech aerospace capability. It's above all alliances. It's America casting itself as the master builder and maintainer of coalitions and alliances to deal with revisionist states, powerful states that are unsatisfied with their position in the world, and that's China, and now we learn Russia. So it's a whole host of things. Behind it all is American power and nuclear weapons power if necessary, but conventional power, cyber power, but more and more, Americans, because it's Obama's policy and because the underlying American financial position is not as dominant as it used to be, America is trying to get allies to do more, to be more willing to take on burdens and to lead in crises. America's term about leading from behind. So all of that is happening. We are assured by Obama in all his speeches that America still insists that it must lead, that it is the indispensable nation, but it clearly doesn't want to do it in such a high-profile, expensive and casualty-suffering way as under Bush.
But do you think that it's actually developing a policy or indeed a capability that can deal with those emerging challenges? Because one reading of Georgia and the Ukraine is that it can huff and puff, but it can't blow the house down.
Well, it's not going to go to war over places that don't matter to it very much, like ultimately Ukraine or Syria. But if it were somewhere that did matter, it would have to matter, like a NATO member, then I think it has either to go to war or be completely destroyed in its credibility. It could no longer play the role it has played in the world if one of its formally acknowledged allies were directly invaded.
Andrew Smith, let me bring you in here because one reading certainly of the figures issued by Spiri recently of arms spending. I think it gave a list of some 23 countries where arms spending has doubled. A lot of them are around the edge of Russia. You're not going to be out of business anytime soon with the campaign, are you?
Oh, unfortunately not. I should say that the main aim of our campaign is for us to campaign ourselves out of business, so to speak. But certainly there are new markets which are growing. And one of the areas which is growing is the unmanned technologies and weapons, although that market is still very much dominated by the US. I mean, the US does still have a large dominance over military spending, even though there is increases in these other markets.
Let's just talk about some of the sort of economic background that Peter raised in the first half of the programme, and you were suggesting the economic ties are strong enough, perhaps, to ameliorate any drive to war. But this is an old theory. It was propagated before the First World War. It didn't prove out to be the case then. What makes you think that it might be now?
Well, it's not necessarily. The guest who was on in the first half on
Chris
the
Coles.
phone, Chris Coles, he made a very important point about proxy wars, and I think that's key. I think what you will probably see, what he said in places like Africa, in sort of places where the interests of the US and China and perhaps Russia, where they collide, you will get proxy wars, and they'll be dirty and there'll be heinous abuses on all sides. But I can't foresee in sort of the next 20 or 30 years a state where the US and Russia or the US and China are going to have a hot war amongst one another. I mean, it's not that, I'm not a liberal IR scholar by any means. I don't necessarily buy into the whole democratic peace theory ideal, but I think that the power relations between those two axes, Russia and China, will be played out in a different way than an actual war with the US.
Well, Keith, let's take up that issue, seeing we're roaming freely around the globe now. Chris Coles was suggesting that there would be more proxy wars in Africa. China's foreign direct investment in the continent now exceeds the US. The US still has the military alliances there. Is that a kind of, if you like, if we're in the kind of foothills of great power conflict, would those kind of proxy wars be slightly higher up the mountain?
I honestly couldn't say. I mean, I think there's been a debate in both in policy-making fields and in international relations scholarship about the emergence of proxy wars, particularly in areas where the nation-state as such is either a vestigial or a contestable concept. I mean, Africa is emerging as a potential area, partly because of its attractions as a resource-rich area. It also has quite clearly governments who cannot police their frontiers. Some of them can't even police their capital cities effectively. So there's plenty of scope for external meddling. And as a continent, in a sense, it's been subject to such for the better part of 100, 200 years nearly. I think the likelihood of more players entering the game is conceivable. I think the United States has interests in protecting certain of the key players in Africa, although it never has been one of the United States' primary areas of interest. And I think that may constrain its own participation in proxy wars in Africa.
I mean, Paul, isn't this one of the sort of elements of American strategy now in regard to Africa, to say to the Europeans, hey, burden sharing, get on with it?
Yeah, but I think it's first of all necessary to point out that proxy wars in Africa are happening with African states as well. It's not just about great power rivalry. If you look at Uganda's role in the Congo and the various roles the Zimbabweans have taken, it's what happens in a thinly governed continent with persistent warlordism. You get any state that's able will take advantage of that to further its own position and particularly access to minerals. So if America and China and Russia play that game too, this isn't surprising. That's the way, unfortunately, the security on that continent is going. As for America's priorities, Africa has not been a major priority, but they've, in the last few weeks, I think, taken out a long lease on the airbase near Djibouti, Camp Lemonnier. The AFRICOM organization is spreading. There are lily pad bases for special forces and helicopters and drones beginning to appear in a whole number of places, because what America doesn't want to tolerate is an Africa where there are safe havens for terrorists. So it's not just about the continent, it's not just about the resources or the people. It's the way that it could become a geopolitical launchpad for wider attacks on American interests. And they're very determined not to let that happen. Although they would rather, and this was the point of Obama's recent West Point speech, they'd rather the locals did it for themselves. It's necessary with European assistance, but there's a $5 billion budget. I mean, yet another $5 billion budget, because there have been other US
Other $5 billion.
Aid security assistance budgets devoted to helping countries like Mali develop the kind of organic national capability to take on terrorism. So there's a whole toolbox of American efforts going on in Africa.
Andrew, I wonder if I get you to comment perhaps on what the kind of arms trade looks like in Africa with as Paul says, both local and international players at work here.
Certainly. I mean, I think one point to make is that whether or not there has been direct Western interventionism within Africa, the Western powers have been more than happy to sell large quantities of weapons to the regimes in Africa. For example, since the Arab Spring in Egypt, we've actually seen arms exports to Egypt from the UK increase tenfold. Similarly, in terms of from 2004, when Colonel Gaddafi was brought in from the cold, he was targeted by a lot of Western nations, whether it was European powers or whether it was across the water in the US, who treated him as a priority and sold large quantities of weapons, which were then turned on Libyan people. So there's always been that. There's always been that ability for Western powers to really try to make a profit out of the situations and of putting arms company profits ahead of the needs of civilians. And that's not unique to Africa. That's happened in the Middle East and other parts of the world as well.
Peter, do you think? I mean, Keith was suggesting, that in a way this is the history of the African continent since the beginning of colonialism. But do you think there's a shift in the pattern of imperial rivalry with the growth of China and this economic presence in Africa?
Do you know? I think part of this is a great discussion. But part of the problem is we're talking in these great powers, but these are people, right? So when a drone hits, somewhere in Yemen, as they have been doing this year, thankfully not so much in Pakistan, but there are real people that die. So we're talking about, great powers here and the US rising and China rising. Yeah, of course, great powers are going to try and increase their economy. Totally, that's what they're there to do. As the gentleman on Skype just said, there are obviously drivers in terms of massive arms companies that, both here in the UK and obviously much more massively in the US and in other states as well, are driven to try and sell as many arms that are deliberately designed to kill people, and in many cases they're subsidised by our taxpayers' money. So I don't know whether or not it's any different from the past. Of course, it'll be different from the past because there'll be different. Obama's different from Truman as the president, and the current leadership in China are different from when it was Mao. The specifics will always be different, but actually it's always individuals that die, and sometimes those individuals get lost in the debate.
It's always individuals who die in ordinary life. It's individuals who die through poverty, through lack of adequate medical attention. Sure, people are dying from drone strikes. Not very many in Africa yet, though that may change. But nowhere near as many are dying from AK-47s or machetes. If you're looking at the causes of insecurity and impoverishment, we shouldn't get obsessed by the high tech.
But I'm not. That's not what I'm doing. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that of course, AK-47s have been around for much longer. They're very, very cheap to make now. For a few dollars, you could chuck out an AK-47. But the actual capability is, drones can be both good and bad. They can be used to, if you've got a massive flood, for instance, that was in the Balkans recently, you could send one over and look for, that's an amazing thing to do, like a real positive humanitarian effort. But it doesn't mean that we have to accept that it also should be used for this military capability, which, when you think about how it's developed, and something like for a while they had second strikes, so they'd chuck one drone in, one missile in, and then 10 minutes later they're chucking another one. I mean, is that not a problem as a civilization that we've decided to do that?
Isn't the point here about the political impact of drones is that it's a piece of weaponry which dramatises the disproportion of power between the people using it and the people on the receiving end of it. It's not that they couldn't be killed more effectively with a machete, but it highlights the impregnability of the people using the weapon and the vulnerability of the people being killed. That's the point, surely.
Yeah, it has an emotional, sort of anti-colonial ring to it. But if we're talking about Africa, and I mean, I thought our subject was
it's the modern version of
but if we're talking about Africa,
we have the Gatling gun and they do
the
not.
The question is surely about government capacity to maintain order in its territory. Governments are supposed to have the monopoly of legitimate violence, and the trouble in Africa is that very often they don't. And so the question ought to be about whether weapons are, and the people who are trained to use them, are being used in a stabilising, non-corrupt way or not.
I suppose one point, I mean, Andrew Smith's point, I mean, let me come back to you, Andrew, is that, let's accept that we like the idea that the government has the sole legitimate use of force. If you keep on flogging weapons to everybody right, left and centre, that's hardly likely to be the case, is it?
Well, that's part of it. When weapons get exported and sold into faraway locations, we don't actually know what happens to them in all cases in the end.
I mean, Libya is the classic case, described as a supermarket for arms after the weapons that were poured in there in order to get rid of Gaddafi.
Well, quite right. And one of the things that's very concerning about Libya is that arms exports to Libya have now been continued. And it wasn't so long ago that the UK was at war with Libya. And I think Libya as a country is still in a state of conflict at the moment. And it's now getting sold guns again. And I think one of the things which is most concerning about the direction of drones is that we have to remember that this is still a very new market. I mean, at the turn of this century, the US military had less than 50 drones in its arsenal, and now it's got over 7,000. So certainly it's showing an exponential growth. And there's also a move towards more almost robotic weapons as well. And I think there are serious ethical questions to be asked about those as well.
We do need a perspective here. I think there's an issue. The United States inventory is in fact something in the region of 11,000 remotely piloted vehicles, but of those, only 400 are in the Predator Reaper class of vehicle, the things that are significant military, strategic, large-scale military, potentially large-scale military platforms. And of those, perhaps only 80 or 90 are fully weaponized. And if you look at the world of these systems, there are relatively few of the RPAS producing countries who have that particular skill. And with due respect to the arms trade, the United States has been very scrupulous about who it leases or sells its Reaper Predator systems to. I'd be much more concerned, in actual fact, about the likelihood of this technology spreading, almost diffusing from generalized sources. And I'm rather more suspicious of the role of perhaps Russia and more significantly of China as a future source of this kind of weaponry.
And the Israelis lead the market apart from the
Much
Americans.
so.
They
Very
have a huge market share.
Peter, coming up to the end now, last question. When we look back in a year's time, will we see the speech as defining a new American foreign policy, or will we say that was a mess and life carried on as normal?
Most likely life carries on as normal. I mean, Obama's pretty much president now, so he's been constrained throughout his whole presidency, and what you'll see as you move ever closer towards the presidential election is that those people who have any reason to object to Obama in any way will do everything in their power to stop anything he wants to do, whether it's closing Guantanamo or whether it's engagement in the US's domestic economy. They'll do everything in their power to obstruct it so that they can say they obstructed it and vote them in again.
Okay, well, that's the end of this edition of Analysis. We'll be watching exactly that unfolding event in the United States in the coming years and months, so do rejoin us for that and other analyses of the world situation. Thank my guests in the studio for joining me and those who've joined me on the line. Don't forget that you can keep up with our discussions by following us on Twitter at the address on the screen now, or you can keep up with the Islam Channel Current Affairs on Facebook. Until next time, Good night.